Chapter 35. Raising my head was a greater effort than anything I had ever felt. If we hadn't lost another golem, I'm not sure I could have done it, but the little thread of energy came back to me, and I looked up. Moll held my eyes for a long moment. Hers were dark and deep, and I don't know what she read in mine. She turned away and went to Nag. He lowered his bony head, and they stood, foreheads pressed together. Living woman. Dead horse. "We have to get away," Harold started to say again, and then the world jumped about 6 inches sideways, and I fell over. "Mona," said Aunt Tabitha. "Here, what's wrong?" Or Spindle. They both grabbed for me, and I realised that neither of them had felt it. I looked up. Molly was swaying. Nag's bones rattled. The thump. The thump. The thump. I would bet everything I will ever own that was the sound of Molly's heartbeat. She walked stiffly around Nag's side and climbed onto him. "Do you hear something?" asked Spindle. In the square, the Carracks fought the slug, and arrows hissed, and the army roared, and steel clashed. But on our side of the barricade, everything seemed strangely silent, except for Nag's bones. I heard it then. It sounded almost like running water far in the distance, coming from within the city. Nattering Molly bent low over Nag's neck. She was shaking like she was sobbing, but she made no noise at all. The sound was getting nearer, louder, deeper. If it was running water, it was a flash flood, not a stream. "Molly," I said. She'd done something magical, something that had made the world jump, something huge. She smiled, just a little, flicked her fingers out, a small, ironic salute. And then the road began to shake. Buildings rattled, as if the knocker were thumping into them. Aunt Tabitha yelled, "Earthquake!" But Spindle let out a whoop and pointed down the street. Knackering Molly had called the dead horses of the city to its defense. And they had come. They were made of bone, like Nag, and flashed ivory in the sun. Many of them must have broken from the ground or from underground crypts, and bits of dust and dirt still clung to them. Some were so old there were hardly any bones, just clouds of dust formed into the shape of running horses. The magic that held them together was so much stronger than anything I could do, anything I'd ever seen. It was no wonder the army had tried to recruit Molly. It was amazing they'd ever let her go. Aunt Tabitha picked up Spindle with one arm and me with the other and shoved us back against the wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Argonel throwing his apprentice into a doorway. The men on the barricade stood and gaped. First the slug, now this. And then some of the smarter ones realized that anyone standing in the way of that charge was going to be trampled. They scattered. The horses hit the barricade, and it fell apart. Bone dust manes whipped behind them. Watching them leap over the remains of the wall was like watching a giant waterfall of bone. I have never seen anything like it, and if I live to be 100, I never will. "How many are there?" asked Aunt Tabitha, almost to herself. I tried to think of how many there could be. Our city is hundreds of years old, and many generations of horses have lived and died within its walls. Molly had called them all. They charged into the square, through the gate, into the Carrack's army, with Nag at their head and Moll on his back, and when the Bone army had finally passed us by, a matter of minutes, I suppose, although it seemed to go on for hours, it took a bit before any of us were willing to leave the walls. When you have seen a thing like that, a thing impossible, and glorious and horrible all at once, it takes a minute before you can really think again. "Oh," said Aunt Tabitha finally. "Oh my." It broke the spell. Spindle jumped up and down and punched the air and shouted, "Ooh-yah, you show 'em all! Give her one for Tibby!" "Is it over?" asked Argonel. "Wizard Mona, is it over?" "I haven't a clue," I admitted, testing my feet cautiously. They seemed to be working. Mostly. Should we go look? As a little knot, Harold and Argonel and Aunt Tabitha and Spindle and I, plus an apprentice and 3 or 4 guards, crept to the edge of the street. The barricade had been pounded into splinters, and we peered out cautiously. There was nothing living in the square. The slug monster oozed a slow circuit around the walls. The broken gates had been torn completely off their hinges. We inched forwards. I leaned heavily on Spindle, partly to keep from falling down, partly to keep him from running off. At the gate, we peered out over the battlefield, and it was a sea of bucking bones. Hundreds of dead horses, from full skeletons to roiling dust, were trampling across the Carracks. The greatest concentration of horses, after all, was not inside the city, but in the bone pits of the knacker yards and slaughterhouses, and those were all outside the walls. Hundreds of horses came from inside the city. Thousands rose from outside it, and they hit the Carracks like a hammer. The mercenaries were backing away from the city, trying to fight. But bones are worse than bread. If you stab a skeleton with a sword, it doesn't stop the skeleton, and the odds are good your sword will get wrenched out of your hands in the process. "They're retreating," breathed Harold. "Sweet mother of us all, they're actually retreating." Nobody was shooting from the battlements anymore. I suspect that the archers, like the rest of us, were simply staring down with slack-jawed awe. We picked our way a little further out from the wall. The road dipped a little, and we could see the skeletal army's charge laid out in front of us. An arrowhead of bone driving deeper and deeper into the enemy's ranks. "They're nearly through," said Argonaut. "They're going to turn around." Harold shook his head. "I don't think we're dealing with normal tactics anymore." The arrowhead pierced through the other side. The mercenary army was cut in half. And apparently that was the final straw, because as we watched, the men stopped even trying to fight back. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a desperate, scrambling flight. The Carrack's army broke and ran. When we found Molly, she was dead. I'd expected it.
Deep breath. It's all right. Take a moment.
I'll get them.
Yep.
I think I had known her since the first moment when she pressed her forehead against the neck.
It's okay. Just take a moment. You're all right.
Oh, great.
You're okay.
I did call her.
Huh? Oh, no. We're going to be right back, folks. We got a nosebleed. Hang on.
It's all right, folks. Don't worry.
Give us just a second.
Where were we? I had expected it.
Start the paragraph over, I'm afraid.
Uh,
I know.
when we found knackering Molly at last, she was dead. I had expected it. I think I'd known since the first moment she pressed her forehead against an axe. She had done what I thought to do with the lost golem. Poured herself into the magic and driven it forward with her death. I'd still hoped I was wrong. She was lying in a little clearing in the middle of the battlefield with 500 bone horses facing inward around her, watching, and there wasn't a mark on her. She was curled up on her side as if she'd slipped off Nag's back and collapsed from exhaustion. And I imagine that was pretty much what had happened after all. It was the magic that killed her, I said hoarsely. She always said getting mixed up with armies and generals will get you killed, said Spindle, wiping his eyes. I could tell he felt guilty for persuading her to come at all, and yet she'd saved us. If he hadn't, the Carracks would be running through the streets, even now. The Duchess and Joshua had come down from the walls, and we all walked through that silent army together. Empty eye sockets turned to follow us as we strode past, and it would have been unbelievably creepy. But I was so tired, and the Carracks army was routed, and there was nothing to feel but relief. And grief. There was still room for grief. She saved us all, said the Duchess. Joshua leaned down and closed Molly's eyes. A great sigh filled the air. The bone horses folded up and dropped to the ground. Clouds of white dust roiled up and settled slowly around us. Nag was the only one left standing, and as we watched, he went down to his knees and stretched out his head along the ground by knackering Molly, and then he was only old bones and rags. And that made me cry even harder. Because that was when I knew it was really over. The Duchess looked at me helplessly. Mona, you knew her. She saved us. Without the two of you, what would we do? What should we do? What would she want? Spindle and I looked at each other, but it was Spindle who spoke up. She and Nag should be buried together. Not in one of those big fancy tombs. You'd think I was stupid. Maybe a park. She would have liked a park. With a statue, perhaps. Where's the Duchess? We have to do something. Spindle and I looked at each other again, and I choked down the lump in my throat and tried very hard to talk. A statue of Nag would be okay, I said, but not a stupid one. Has to have Nag in it like he really was, not, heroic. She shouldn't have had to be a hero. No, said the Duchess, no. No one should. Joshua picked Molly up very carefully and carried her back to the city. Our city. And we all went home. Significant tea.
And a hug. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Oh, Molly.
That was hard.
I know.
It was very hard.
Ursula owes you a muffin basket.
Ursula owes me a muffin basket, y'all.
Chapter 36.
Chapter 36. The army arrived 2 days later. A day late, as it turned out, but that was okay. Most of the Carracks didn't stop running until they hit the mountains. The army got home in time to mop up some of the stragglers and most of the wounded, all of whom wanted to surrender. They got put to work rebuilding the outlying farms. The Duchess had a certain sense of poetic justice. All told, apart from knackering Molly, we lost 7 people. 5 of those were on the barricades. 1 was an old veteran who had volunteered to help fight and whose heart gave out in the middle of the battle, and 1 guard who was found in an alley with his throat cut. We're pretty sure that was the work of the late Spring Green Man. There were a few more on the outlying farms who'd refused to evacuate, but there wasn't anything I could have done about them, and I tried very hard not to feel guilty. Joshua says that we took so few casualties. What a stupid word. There's nothing casual about it, because the golems held them off until Molly did her part, and I like to think he's right. The Golden General offered me a post in the army, but I told him I didn't want to even think about making golems for at least a year, and Aunt Tabitha pointed out I was 14 and not nearly old enough to go traipsing about with the military, which was sort of embarrassing but also a relief. It's just hard to say no to someone like the Golden General. And I was going to say no. I still liked Lord Ethan, but I wasn't going to be responsible for turning other people into heroes. Oberon's personal possessions, a ring and some papers, turned up on the battlefield, but they couldn't identify a body. Spindle had a theory about this, which includes the phrase, mangled beyond recognition. He's quite gleeful about it. I have a different theory. I think it's possible he got away and left a false trail behind him. As long as he stays far, far away from my city, that's fine. I'd like to see him punished, but even more than that, I just want him gone. Pardon me. Spindle lives with us now. We repainted the room so it's not pink and doesn't have a sampler in it. I'm not sure if he really wanted to live with us, but the Duchess threatened to knight him, and if you're going to be a knight, you have to be a squire. And when he found out that you spend all your time taking care of some guy's armour and his horse and taking lessons in chivalry, he couldn't get out fast enough. It was still a matter of the ceremony, though. Stop fidgeting, said Aunt Tabitha, straightening the folds of my dress. Don't wring your skirt in your hands, you'll get it all crumpled. It was very kind of the Duchess to do this all at once, I said faintly, trying hard not to grab handfuls of cloth and twist them. If I had to go through this for every single medal, I'd die. You won't die, said Aunt Tabitha. You'll do fine. She fussed with my hair, which was, of course, hopeless. Everybody will be looking at the Duchess, I thought, or at Spindle. Compared to Spindle, I was positively presentable. The Duchess would happily have given him a dozen suits of formal clothing, but he was having none of it. We compromised on the page's uniform he'd worn that long ago night in the palace. 2 weeks. It had been 2 weeks. I felt like I had aged so much in the last 2 weeks, I half expected my hair to start coming in white. Spindle tugged at the collar of his tunic and muttered something in thieves' cant. The gingerbread man stood on my shoulder. He had new lacing buttons for the occasion. Joshua opened the door and said, "We're ready for you." "I'm scared," I whispered. "So am I," Joshua said back. "I hate these things. You're up first, so you get to leave early. Think I'm getting made a marshal. I have to stay to the end." This made me feel a little better. At least they weren't making me a marshal. We stepped out of the room into a narrow corridor with a door at the end. Joshua opened the door, which led onto a courtyard. We were having an outdoor ceremony. 2 guards on either side clicked the butts of their halberds against the floor, and I gulped. "Straight ahead," murmured Joshua. Stop on the 3rd step of the dais next to the general. Spindle, go right behind her. Stop on the 2nd step. We walked in. I went up 3 steps, staring at my feet to make sure that I didn't trip and fall. When I reached the Golden General, I looked up. He looked just as tall as he had the first time I'd seen him, but a lot more tired. His shoulders were a little stooped, and he had lines around his eyes. And he winked at me. The Duchess stood in the middle of the dais on the highest step. "My people," she began, waving to the crowd, and then I couldn't hear her anymore, over the cheering. "Caw," muttered Spindle at my right hand. "Look at all the swells." The swells were the entire assembled court. There were a lot of nobles. I guess those were the council. Most of them looked old, richly dressed, somewhat disgruntled, but there was one plump woman who grinned at me. I think she was the representative of the various guilds. And you see, Aunt Tabitha was a guild baker, so technically I was one of her people. I wondered if having a baker save the city would have any political repercussions. Uncle Albert was in the front row, off to one side, and Aunt Tabitha came out and joined him. Argonel was there too. I'd asked if Jenny could join them, and she was wedged in behind Aunt Tabitha, and they were all grinning hugely, except for Uncle Albert. He met my eyes and nodded. I wondered what sort of ceremony they'd had when they gave him a medal for a siege that shouldn't have happened. Past all the brightly coloured nobles were several ranks of guards in shiny armour and a huge crowd of plain, ordinary citizens. My people. They were packed to the walls of the courtyard and out past the carriage drive, standing on each other's shoulders to try and get a better view. I actually saw Widow Holloway on the shoulders of Brutus the Chandler. Oh, that's a lot of people. I wondered if I was going to faint or scream or wet myself or disgrace myself in some other way, and honestly, it seemed quite likely. Blueberry muffins. Think about blueberry muffins. What's the recipe? Step 1, get some fresh blueberries. Don't usually get a crowd like this unless there's a hanging. Shut up, Spindle. The Golden General chuckled. First time's the worst, he murmured to me. First time I won a great victory and I had to get medals, I almost wished I'd lost instead. They get easier after this. You'll see. I don't intend to do this again, I whispered. No. He arched an eyebrow at me. I expect this won't be your last set of medals, my dear. Heroism, something of a habit. It would not have occurred to me 2 weeks ago to argue with the Golden General, but I opened my mouth to do just that, and then I heard the Duchess say, Mona, the wizard of the bakery, step forward. And the crowd went completely wild, and Lord Ethan put a hand on my shoulder and steered me forwards. I looked up at the Duchess. She smiled down at me, wearing the mask of royalty, and then she winked too. She put something over my head. It was a round disc with sheaves of wheat stamped on it. This is the silver sheaf, the highest honour our city gives out, for exceptional valour. Then there was another one, which she pinned to my chest, which had a golden lion on it, for extraordinary service to the crown. And then there was another one on a pin, which looked like an incredibly ugly bronze cow, folded into a little square for courage under fire. The crowd roared for each one. I closed my eyes and thought very firmly about Muffins. It pleases us to recognise the service and exceptional courage of one of our youngest citizens. Henceforth, let it be known, Mona, wizard of the bakery, is appointed a royal wizard with all the rank and privileges thereof. A royal wizard, like Master Gildean and Lord Ethan, I gulped. And for you, little friend, said the Duchess, sounding remarkably like Obi-Wan Kenobi. For a second, I didn't know who she was talking to, and then, on a very small ribbon, she pulled out a medal that looked like the silver sheaf, only about the size of a penny. She placed it around the neck of the gingerbread man. You have not lived until you've seen a cookie look smug. He fell down.
Hold on. There he is.
And yes, Marguerite made the medal.
It won't stay up, but... Okay, fine. I'll take a picture of him later. Sorry, I'm ruining the moment.
Turn around, murmured the Duchess, count to 5, and then step to your left. We'll get Spindle up here, and then you can both leave. Lucky you. It occurred to me then that the Duchess probably hated these ceremonies almost as much as I did. At least I only had to do it once, no matter what the Golden General might think. I turned around. The crowd cheered so loudly it actually no longer sounded like voices, and I will tell you that just for 1 minute there I bought into it. Just a little. My city, right there. I almost forgot to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Spindle came up, and he got the lion and the folded-up cow and the bronze sheaf for slightly less extraordinary service to the crown. He didn't seem to mind. The crowd cheered for him too, and Jenny blew kisses from behind Argonel. And then the cheering faded, and Harold, who was standing on the far side of the stage, beckoned, and we were walked down the dais and through the door, and were finally allowed to go home for good. Significant tea. Chapter 37. Things do go back to normal. Eventually. Joshua comes in sometimes for muffins. Once or twice I've been up to the palace to have tea with the Duchess. It's awkward, not so much because she's the Duchess, but because after everything was over, I realised I was still angry at her for not being braver or smarter or more something. When you're in charge of the whole city, you're responsible. It shouldn't be up to a couple of kids and a mad woman on a bone horse to fix the mess you allowed to happen. But then I go have tea and I look at her and I don't know if she really could have fixed it. She's only in charge because she inherited the city, the same way I'll inherit the bakery. I think maybe she's not as good at ruling as I am at baking, and then I don't know what to think or who to be mad at anymore, and I get really confused. I did hear from Jenny that something's gone a bit odd in the palace kitchens. Something keeps knocking over the pepper shakers and putting salt in the sugar bowl. One night it tied all the aprons in the place together and hung them on the roasting spit. I think it might be one of the bad cookies. I thought I pulled all the magic out, but, it was a frantic time. Maybe one squeaked by. One of these days I'll go to the kitchens and get to the bottom of things. If the cook asks me nicely. As for me, I work at the bakery and I'm glad to do it. Sometimes people come in to see the medals and talk to one of the heroes of the Dead Horse War. But more often, they come in for muffins and scones and gingerbread. We still have the best sourdough in the city, even though Bob's experience in battle has made him extra rambunctious, and we have to feed him on the end of a pole, which he sometimes dissolves. Uncle Albert won't even go in the cellar now. My own special gingerbread cookie is with me still. He stands guard on a shelf over the bakery counter and keeps a careful eye on the customers. Oberon and the Spring Green Man may be gone, but you never know. The Golden General took me aside a few days after the battle. I told him what Master Gildean had said about him, and he laughed. It's all true, he said. He didn't look nearly as much like a young sun god in his office with his boots up on the desk. I really couldn't hold off an army by myself. You, though. His eyes were fixed on my face. You did for quite a long time. An hour or two. An hour in battle is an eternity, said Lord Ethan. He took his feet off the desk and leaned forwards. You need to be trained. Magic like that is too powerful to waste. I don't want to end up like Molly. I said. Government wizard, she called Lord Ethan. No good for the likes of you and me. And yet, the Golden General, hero of the realm. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. That poor woman, power like that. Well, I wasn't even a raw recruit when she went into battle, and I shudder to think how they mishandled her. We failed her. I want to make sure that we do not fail you. I stared at my hands. I meant what I said at the ceremony, he said. When I looked up, he had a rueful smile, the sort you give to a friend or a colleague, not a little kid. Heroism is a bad habit. Once you've done it, other people start to expect it, and if the city's in danger again, everybody will remember that you saved them last time, and they'll forget all the nasty, exhausting bits where you nearly died and had to sleep for a week, and your headache didn't go away for 3 days, and it was only 2 days, I mumbled. The headache in question had hit me like a ton of bricks on the walk off the battlefield. Joshua had actually carried me to bed. Apparently that's normal with magic when you really, really overdo it. Well, you're young. If I tried magic like that now, I'd have to hope it killed me, because recuperating from it would be worse. I snorted. Come up to the palace when you can, he said, and said it kindly. We'll give you some training. You might find it useful. We're not going to drag you off. If we tried, your aunt would have something to say, and Lord, I'd much rather face the Carracks. He shuddered theatrically, and I had to laugh, but it didn't last long. The Duchess, I began, without knowing how I even wanted to finish the sentence. Yes. If she just stopped Oberon, I cried. I felt like something had been building in my chest since knackering Molly died. I wanted to scream or weep or rage or something to make sense of it all. Why didn't she stop it? Why didn't anyone stop it? His eyes flicked to the door. I think he was making sure that it was closed and no one was listening. It occurred to me then that what I had just said might be treason. I had said it to the man in charge of the army. Maybe his next words were going to be to tell me to shut up or be thrown in the dungeon. Instead, he looked straight at me and said, I know. I put my head in my hands and stared at the floor. The carpet had a pattern of interlocking lightning bolts. The Golden General sighed. I have been exactly where you are. But what can we do? You can't put the military in charge of the city. We're useful servants, but we are terrible masters. And if I took it in my head to declare myself a wizard emperor, like Elgar dreamed of doing, well, I hope like hell someone would stop me. We met each other's eyes and then we both looked away. After a minute, I said, I never wanted to be a hero. His face was solemn. Nobody ever does. I probably will go up to the palace to learn at least a few things. There's a lot of concepts in Spiraling Shadows I still don't understand, and the General was right about one thing. Nobody was going to forget who saved them. You never know when somebody's going to need you to defend the city, but learning is as far as I'm willing to go. Molly was right. People in power can crush you like a bug. I don't want to be crushed, and I also don't want to be in a position to crush anyone else. At the moment, though, all I want to do is make muffins and bread and learn to be the best baker in the city, because magic is exhausting. So if you ever happen to be passing down Market Street before you get into the Rat's Elbow, take the turn onto Wolfish and go down about half a block. You'll find yourself at the very best bakery in the city, and if I'm in a good mood, and if you ask very nicely, I might even make the gingerbread men get up and dance. Thank you.
Go ahead and read the acknowledgements.
I will. Acknowledgements. Mona's story took longer to get into book form than almost any other project I have ever worked on. I began it at the tail end of 2007. I didn't know how to bake. I still don't. But I bought a KitchenAid mixer and began grimly following recipes, not so much because I wanted to become a baker as because I needed to understand how dough felt and what it did when you shoved your fingers into it. The route that Bread Wizard book took to publication went from pillar to post and back again. It was bought, edited, re-edited, dropped, banned, and handed off to other editors, sold back to me, pitched again by my unfailingly optimistic agent, and editor after editor could not figure it out. Many of them liked it, but what would they do with it? It needed to be darker. No, darker. No, wait, that's too dark. Mona was too old. Mona was too young. Mona was the correct age, but now sounded too old and needed to be made sweeter. Did I really need to start with a dead girl? Could we maybe ease into the whole dead body situation? Ultimately, the problem was that it was a fairly dark children's book, and I, under the name Ursula Vernon, was a writer of whimsical, upbeat books. If a publisher bought it, they would need me to write about 4 other books first before they could slip it into the lineup, or else my brand would be in limbo. Mind you, I have always felt that kids like much darker books than adults are comfortable handing them, but I also understand that parents and librarians are the ones who control the book buying, and a weird little anti-establishment book with carnivorous sourdough and armies of dead horses was probably a hard sell. So eventually I just published it myself, as T. Kingfisher, whose brand is mostly things I felt like writing. Minor Mage, my first kids' book that was also too dark to really be a kids' book, found an enthusiastic audience. I hope that A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking does as well. Ironically, I am publishing this in the midst of COVID-19, when we are all starting to make sourdough at home and then protesting... I've completely screwed the sentence. Ironically, I am publishing this in the midst of COVID-19, when we all started making sourdough at home and then started protesting police brutality. Suddenly, a 12-year-old book was actually relevant. Go figure. Thanks go as always to the lovely guys at Argyle for putting out the print volume, to my awesome proofreaders Jess and Cassie, and my long-suffering editor KB, to Shepherd for insisting that it was good. Really? Even if they did try to change monarch into parasite on the working class in the edits. And as always, to my beloved Kevin, who reads things when I am panicking and convinced everything is awful. You are all wonderful, and I love you like gingerbread loves spice. T. Kingfisher, North Carolina, June 2020. And there we go.